Claire Morgan boarded Flight 237 from New York to Los Angeles with the quiet determination of someone who valued anonymity. She had no intention of standing out, no desire to spark conversation with fellow passengers. Her life revolved around silence, as she carried it like a protective shield. The book in her tote bag was more of a prop than genuine reading material. She preferred watching people without being watched herself. On airplanes, she often faded into the background, so completely that attendants sometimes forgot to offer her drinks. She liked it that way. She slid into her aisle seat near the middle of the cabin, nodding politely at the older couple already seated in her row. They smiled briefly, then returned to whispering between themselves. Claire tucked her bag under the seat, buckled in, and exhaled slowly. The hum of the engines was comforting, almost hypnotic. Flying was one of the few times in life when silence came naturally, imposed by circumstance. The white noise of the cabin made it easy to retreat into herself. As the plane climbed steadily, she let her eyes wander. The cabin was filled with the usual mixed businessmen typing furiously on laptops, a family juggling restless children, college students dozing with earbuds in. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet Claire always paid closer attention than most. Years of advocacy work had trained her to study people, to search for the tells beneath the surface. A clenched jaw, a twitch in the hand, eyes that darted too often. She catalogued details unconsciously, as if her mind were always bracing for some hidden danger. The first hour passed uneventfully. Flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle, offering drinks and pretzels. Claire refused politely, keeping her hands folded in her lap. She preferred to stay light when flying, both in body and in thought. Around her, conversations picked up. Laughter trickled from the row behind. A child giggled at a cartoon on a tablet. It felt almost peaceful. Then came the jolt. At first, passengers assumed it was turbulence. The plane shook slightly, and a few people laughed nervously. But then the movement wasn't followed by the reassuring voice of the captain. Instead, a figure erupted from the back of the cabin, charging forward with terrifying intensity. He wore a black mask pulled tight across his face, his dark jacket hanging loosely, concealing nothing of the pistol he held aloft. "Everyone down," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Hands where I can see them. Nobody moves." The shift in the cabin was instant. Screams pierced the air. A glass shattered on the floor. The attendants froze mid-step, their trays trembling. One man tried to rise, but the hijacker shoved him back violently, the barrel of the gun inches from his chest. Claire did not scream. She did not move. Her silence was deliberate, as though she had trained for this moment her entire life. While others panicked, her mind sharpened. Her eyes locked on the gunman, not with open defiance, but with a quiet calculation that went unnoticed by most. She studied him like a puzzle. The way his grip wasn't steady, the way his words stumbled, slightly betraying nerves. The mask couldn't hide the sheen of sweat glistening at his temple. Around her, chaos grew. A mother shielded her child beneath her coat. A businessman begged under his breath. The couple beside Claire clutched hands, tightly, trembling uncontrollably. She remained still, hands folded neatly in her lap, her breathing steady. To anyone glancing at her, she might have appeared frozen in fear. But inside, she was already dissecting the situation. The hijacker barked orders toward the cockpit, threatening to shoot if the pilots didn't comply. His accent was hard to place, his words tinged with desperation more than authority. "This flight is mine now," he shouted. "You will listen, or you will die." Claire noticed something others didn't. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone else to appear. That flicker of doubt, that lack of full control, was a weakness. And weaknesses, Claire knew, were exploitable. Still, she remained silent. Across the cabin, her eyes caught on another detail: several men seated separately, scattered like ordinary passengers, but carrying themselves with military precision. Their stillness was different from hers. It wasn't fear. It was restraint. They scanned the hijacker with trained eyes, gauging angles, distances, opportunities. Claire recognized the look immediately. These men were professionals, soldiers, and the one seated 3 rows ahead of her, closest to the hijacker, was clearly their commander. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He didn't nod. He didn't signal. But Claire knew. Recognition passed between them like a spark. She lowered her gaze quickly, not wanting to draw attention. She had no weapon, no official authority, no reason to be involved. Yet something inside her stirred. Her silence wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about readiness. The hijacker marched down the aisle, waving the gun at random passengers. He demanded wallets, phones, anything of value, tossing them into a backpack he carried. His movements grew increasingly erratic, his voice louder, cracking with every shout. Fear spread like wildfire, but beneath it, an undercurrent of disbelief lingered. Passengers kept glancing toward the cockpit door, hoping the pilots or crew would save them. No one dared move. Claire kept watching. She noticed the way the gunman's finger rested dangerously close to the trigger, not with control, but with instability. One wrong twitch and disaster would follow. The commander noticed too. He shifted slightly in his seat, his hand brushing the edge of his jacket. Claire knew he had a weapon hidden there, but he didn't act. Not yet. The wrong move could get passengers killed. Timing was everything. Claire pressed her palms against her knees, steadying herself. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. She thought of her childhood, of the nights when shouting filled her home, when chaos reigned, and the only way to endure was to disappear into stillness. Silence had saved her then. Now it was saving her again. The hijacker slammed the butt of his gun against an overhead bin, shouting at a terrified man to sit down. The noise reverberated through the cabin. A baby cried uncontrollably. The gunman's head whipped around, fury in his eyes, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Claire's gaze never left him. She counted his breaths, the rhythm of his steps, the distance between him and the nearest seal. Every detail mattered. She wasn't just watching, she was preparing. And though no one knew it yet, Claire Morgan, the silent passenger who had boarded unnoticed, was already becoming the key to everything that would follow. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And when the moment came, the world would finally hear her. The cabin had fallen into a suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that was heavy and trembling with fear. The hijacker fed on it, his voice filling the space as though volume alone could mask the cracks in his confidence. He stalked the aisle, with the gun raised, his movements jerky, desperate. "You will do exactly as I say," he shouted, his words bouncing off the cabin walls. "No heroics, no tricks. I want money. I want recognition. And I want my message broadcast to the world. You people are pawns until I get what I demand." Passengers shrank lower into their seats. Mothers shielded children. Business travelers clutched briefcases as if they were life rafts, and whispers of prayers filled the air like invisible threads of hope. The hijacker's pistol swung from face to face, making every breath a gamble. Claire Morgan did not move. She sat straight, her hands folded, her eyes coolly trained on him, as though she were watching a case unfold in court. Years of advocacy work had hardened her resolve. Fear could not dictate her actions. Fear was what made people careless, and careless people made mistakes. She was not about to make one. What struck her most was how erratic he appeared. His finger twitched against the trigger, Sweat darkened the collar of his jacket. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts, betraying a frantic heart. Claire catalogued every detail. He was not calm. He was not in control. And most importantly, he was not truly ready for what he had begun. Behind her, a young woman sobbed uncontrollably, her trembling so violent that the hijacker spun and barked at her. "Shut up! I said shut up!" His shout cracked like a whip. The girl slapped her hand over her mouth, muffling her cries. The hijacker moved on, but the moment left a scar of terror across the cabin. Claire's gaze flicked briefly to the group of men scattered throughout the plane. They looked ordinary enough. Business suits, travel jackets, nothing remarkable, but their posture betrayed them. Shoulders straight, eyes constantly moving, breathing controlled. She knew enough to recognize training when she saw it. These weren't civilians. And then there was the man 3 rows ahead of her, the one who, like her, wasn't panicking, the one whose movements were subtle but purposeful. He was calm in a way no civilian could ever be. His every motion was calculated, his stillness deliberate. Claire's lawyer's mind pieced it together. Military, definitely. Special forces, most likely. Their eyes met again for a brief second. The connection was undeniable. She could see in his expression that he was assessing her too. Perhaps he noticed her stillness, her refusal to fold into panic like everyone else. In that silent exchange, a strange bond formed, unspoken but powerful. The hijacker rattled his demands again. Louder this time. "We will land, and the world will listen to me. I want my people freed. I want money, supplies, recognition. No one leaves this plane until I get what I demand." His words were met with more silence, broken only by muffled sobs and nervous shifting in seats. Claire wondered if even he fully understood what he wanted. His list of demands was scattered, unfocused. She recognized desperation when she saw it. This was not the meticulous plan of a hardened operative. It was the act of someone grasping for power he could barely hold. The flight attendants stood frozen near the galley, their faces pale, eyes darting between passengers and the weapon. One of them, a young man with shaking hands, tried to speak. "Please, if you just stay calm. Shut your mouth." The hijacker snapped, thrusting the gun in his direction. The attendant flinched backward, nearly tripping over the beverage cart. The hijacker laughed bitterly, as if the power surge comforted him. But Claire saw through it. It wasn't real control. It was the illusion of control, and illusions could be broken. The commander in the 3rd row ahead shifted slightly, leaning an elbow on the armrest, as though settling into his seat. To anyone else, it looked casual. But Claire noticed the subtle twitch of his eyes, the way his hand lingered near his jacket. He was waiting for something for the right moment. Claire inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Her father had always taught her to listen more than she spoke, to observe before she acted. She had carried that lesson into her career, winning cases not with theatrics, but with precision. And now, in this cabin filled with terror, her silence gave her clarity. The hijacker turned suddenly and began demanding passengers hand over their belongings. Wallets, jewelry, phones all tossed into his backpack. He snatched them with trembling hands, shoving them away as though possessions were currency for power. When he reached Claire's row, the elderly couple beside her fumbled with their rings and credit cards, nearly dropping them in panic. The hijacker snatched the items greedily, his gaze flicking briefly toward Claire. She met his eyes, calm, steady, unflinching. It unsettled him. "Your bag?" he snapped, gesturing toward the tote under her seat. Claire bent slowly, retrieving it, her movements precise, deliberate. She handed it over without a word, her gaze still locked on him. He yanked it from her grasp, rifling through quickly. Finding nothing of value beyond a book and a wallet, He tossed it back into her lap. For a moment, their eyes lingered. His breath hitched slightly, his jaw tightening. Something about her silence unnerved him. Most passengers were pliant, begging, shaking, desperate to appease. But she was different. He turned sharply and moved on, but Claire knew she had unsettled him. A seed of doubt had been planted. The SEAL commander had noticed too. She felt his gaze again, brief but purposeful. He was assessing her not just as a passenger, but as someone who might matter in what was coming. The hijacker returned to the front of the cabin, shouting at the cockpit door, demanding that the pilot announce his message. His shouts echoed, but Claire no longer heard only his words. She heard the instability beneath them. Every demand was less convincing, every gesture more frantic. Passengers remained paralyzed, terrified to draw his attention. But Claire sat quietly, her mind turning over every angle. The distance between him and the cockpit, the number of steps it would take to close in, the positioning of the SEALs, the state of his hands trembling more now than before. Her silence wasn't fear, it was preparation. And though no one else could see it yet, she was already becoming part of the battle. The plane had settled into an uneasy rhythm of fear. The hijacker paced the aisle like a predator, who wasn't sure if he could actually bite, waving his pistol as if the motion itself was enough to keep the passengers caged. He barked threats every few minutes, but his words began to sound less like commands and more like a man convincing himself he was in control. From her seat, Claire Morgan didn't flinch. Her silence was sharper than the chaos around her. She watched him intently, noting every detail, the uneven cadence of his steps, the beads of sweat rolling from his temple, the way his left hand trembled each time he adjusted his grip on the weapon. He was coming apart, slowly, like fabric, unraveling at the edges. Across the aisle, 3 rows ahead, the man she had already recognized as military studied the hijacker with surgical precision. His stillness was commanding, his face unreadable. To most passengers, he looked like any other traveler, but to Claire, his discipline stood out as clearly as a uniform. The way he observed without panic, how his muscles remained coiled but controlled, this was a man trained for situations like these. Their eyes met again, just briefly. It wasn't long enough for the hijacker to notice, but it was long enough to send a charge through Claire. There was no panic in his gaze. Instead, there was calculation, the same calculation she knew he must have seen in hers. It was as though they had silently acknowledged one another. You see what I see. The hijacker slammed the butt of his gun against an overhead compartment, shouting at no one in particular. Don't test me. I'll do it, I swear. The world will hear me. His voice cracked, desperation seeping through the cracks of rage. A child whimpered from a row near the back, and the hijacker spun on his heel, gun raised. The child's mother threw herself over him, shielding him with her body, whispering frantically, "Please, please, he's just a boy." The hijacker froze, his chest heaved. His finger twitched against the trigger. For one sickening moment, Claire thought he might actually fire. But then he cursed loudly, kicking the edge of a seat before storming toward the front again. The boy cried softly into his mother's arms. The SEAL commander's jaw tightened, though he didn't move. Claire could see the calculation in his face, the balance between intervening too early and waiting for the right moment. Timing was everything, and timing right now was wrong. Claire pressed her palms flat against her knees, steadying her breath. She thought of her father, a man who had taught her to shoot on a rural farm when she was still a teenager. At the time, she hated it, hated the noise and the recoil, hated the way her hands stung afterward. But he had insisted it wasn't about liking it, it was about being ready. Life didn't always give you choices. Sometimes you had to act, even when you didn't want to. She hadn't touched a firearm in years. Yet here, in this tense cabin, those lessons echoed back to her like a voice from the past. The hijacker reached the cockpit door and slammed his fist against it. "Open this door. Do you hear me? I'm not playing." His words were shrill, his authority waning. He shouted again, banging harder. The door remained locked. The pilot's voice didn't respond. That silence seemed to fuel his fury. Claire noticed something subtle. The SEAL commander leaned slightly to his left, enough to catch a reflection of the cockpit and the polished trim of the overhead bin. He wasn't just watching the hijacker. He was watching for signals, maybe from the crew. She realized then that this man wasn't just reacting. He was coordinating in silence, reading the whole scene as though it were a battlefield. The hijacker spun suddenly, glaring down the aisle at the rows of terrified faces. His eyes swept across the passengers, and for one terrifying second, they landed on Claire. She didn't look away. Her gaze was level, unflinching, and that unsettled him. He expected fear, submission, pleading. Instead, he found calm, as if she weren't afraid of him at all. His nostrils flared. He barked at her. "What are you staring at?" Claire didn't answer. The silence between them stretched, tense and heavy. The passengers around her shrank deeper into their seats, terrified that she had drawn his rage. But Claire remained still. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was presence, a refusal to cower. The hijacker snarled, waving the gun in her direction. Before scoffing, "Keep your eyes down, woman," he turned sharply and stomped back toward the galley. Claire's heart pounded, but her expression never shifted. She knew she had unsettled him again, and that mattered. In a hostage situation, psychological advantage was as important as physical force. If he began doubting himself, cracks would form faster. A SEAL commander leaned back slightly, as if casually adjusting his posture, but his eyes slid to her once more. This time, his look was longer, more deliberate. Claire read it as clearly as words. "You are different." She couldn't explain why she felt compelled to match his stare, but she did. For a few seconds, the chaos around them blurred, and the two of them shared something unspoken, an alliance forming without agreement, without words, built purely on observation and recognition. The hijacker, meanwhile, continued his pacing. His voice grew louder, but less coherent. He shouted about oppression, about injustice, about revenge. But his words lacked conviction. Like someone parroting lines he only half believed. Claire caught the irony. He demanded the world listen to him, yet even here, in this confined cabin, no one truly was. Fear muted everything. The passengers remained paralyzed, every one of them praying that someone else would act. But Claire knew better. Rescue wasn't going to descend magically. And while the SEALs were professionals, their hands were tied by circumstance. They couldn't risk dozens of lives on a poorly timed move. Claire's silence, however, gave her a different kind of power. She could move under the radar. She was overlooked, dismissed, invisible. And invisibility could be a weapon if wielded properly. Her father's voice echoed in her head again. "Watch, wait, and when the time comes, act without hesitation." The time wasn't yet, but it was coming. And when it arrived, Claire Morgan knew she would not stay silent any longer. The hijacker's pacing grew more erratic, his threats louder but less coherent. He stormed up and down the narrow aisle, jerking the pistol toward passengers as if daring someone to test him. Every sudden motion made the air thicken with dread. Mothers clutched children tighter, men froze in rigid silence, and the elderly pressed trembling hands together as though prayer might shield them. Claire Morgan sat unmoving, her stillness deliberate. She had long ago learned that silence could disarm more than words ever could. It allowed her to observe, to calculate. And right now, calculation was everything. Then the moment came that shifted everything. The hijacker spun suddenly toward the nearest flight attendant, a young woman no older than 25, standing frozen by the beverage cart. "You! Bring me water!" he barked, pointing the gun at her face. The attendant's hands shook so badly she could barely twist the cap off a bottle. She offered it with trembling fingers, but before she could extend it fully, the hijacker snarled, "Pathetic," and struck her hard across the face with the back of his hand. The sound of a fall. The slap cracked through the cabin like gunfire. The woman stumbled sideways, colliding with the cart, nearly falling. Gasps erupted from passengers, a wave of horror that rippled through the rows. Claire's fists clenched against her knees. She did not gasp. She did not flinch. But inside, something cold and sharp ignited. Violence had crossed from threat to reality. This was no longer about fear alone. He was willing to harm, and once willing, escalation was inevitable. The SEAL commander 3 rows ahead, half rose from his seat. His posture screamed readiness, his muscles coiled like springs. For a heartbeat, Claire thought he might charge. But the hijacker swung the gun wildly in response, forcing him back. The commander sat again, but not in defeat. His eyes narrowed, assessing the timing, recalculating. The hijacker laughed bitterly at the collective terror, feeding on it like a starving man. He jabbed the gun toward the attendant on the floor. "Stay down, move again, and I'll kill you." The young woman crawled back, tears streaking her cheeks. Another attendant moved instinctively to help, but the hijacker screamed at her too, silencing her with the threat of the weapon. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. She hated violence. She had spent her career in courtrooms, fighting battles with words, laws, and reason. But watching someone struck defenselessly awakened a dormant part of her, part she had buried long ago on her father's farm, when he made her hold a rifle for the first time. She had hated it then, but she understood it now. Some threats couldn't be argued away. Some dangers demanded force. The hijacker paced back toward the cockpit, muttering angrily. His erratic behavior betrayed unraveling control. Claire noted it carefully. His strike against the attendant hadn't made him stronger. It had made him weaker. Violence, rather than cementing dominance, revealed desperation. Then, unexpectedly, the SEAL commander shifted. Quietly, smoothly, he slid into the empty seat beside Claire. His motion was so natural, it barely drew attention, but Claire knew better. Every move he made was calculated for minimal disruption. For a moment, they sat in silence. The commander kept his gaze forward, his voice low, nearly inaudible, beneath the hum of the engines. "You see it too, don't you?" Claire didn't look at him. She didn't nod. But her eyes followed the hijacker's pacing steps, and her. Silence was answer enough. The commander continued, voice steady but laced with urgency. "He's unstable. He's losing control faster than he realizes. That makes him more dangerous." Claire finally turned slightly, her voice so soft it barely reached him. "Desperation is predictable." He glanced at her, studying her face. Not many passengers think like that under pressure. She returned her gaze to the hijacker, speaking carefully. Not many passengers grew up in chaos. Silence was survival. You learn to see patterns if you want to stay alive. The commander absorbed her words, his expression tightening with something that looked like respect. "We need a diversion," he murmured. Something to shift his focus long enough to act. Claire didn't reply. Instead, she adjusted slightly in her seat, her composure unshaken. Her silence carried more weight than promises. The hijacker spun again, waving the gun wildly. "Hands up. Everyone's hands where I can see them," he shouted. Panic rippled instantly through the cabin as passengers obeyed, arms trembling in the air like surrendering prisoners. Claire didn't move. Her arms remained at her sides, her body motionless. The hijacker's eyes swept across the sea of raised hands until they stopped on hers. His brow furrowed, suspicion flaring. "You? Why aren't your hands up?" Claire lifted her chin slightly, her gaze meeting his without fear. Her voice was calm, measured. "Because fear makes people weak," the cabin gasped. Passengers shrank, horrified she had spoken. The hijacker sneered, striding closer. "What did you say?" Claire held his gaze. "You wanted control. Look around. You already have it. Pointing a gun at frightened people doesn't make you strong. It makes you desperate." The hijacker's face contorted, confusion mingling with rage. For a moment, he seemed lost for words. He stepped closer, the gun aimed at her chest. "You think you're clever? You think you're braver than the rest?" Claire's voice remained steady, her heartbeat betraying nothing. "No, I just see you for what you are." The tension in the cabin spiked to a breaking point. Every passenger held their breath, waiting for the crack of a gunshot. But the commander beside her spoke suddenly, his voice low, carrying just enough to divert. "She's right," the hijacker snapped toward him, startled. The commander leaned back casually, eyes narrowed in feigned disinterest. "If you wanted to prove strength, you would have done it already. Instead, you're shouting at civilians. You don't scare me. You bore me." The hijacker's nostrils flared, his grip tightening. He pointed the gun between them, his anger shifting wildly. His fury had split. Claire saw it instantly, the crack widening. She had rattled him. The commander had deepened the fracture. The hijacker growled, stepping back slightly, as though retreating from the sudden spotlight. His breathing was erratic now, his voice rising with false bravado. "Shut up, both of you. Don't test me." He stormed toward the back again, leaving the cabin in stunned silence. Claire exhaled slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time, she had spoken aloud, and in doing so, shifted the balance. The commander leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "You know what you just did?" Claire didn't answer. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "You became the one he's afraid of." She turned her eyes forward, her silence returning. But inside, she knew he was right. The hijacker's fury had exposed something deeper, fear. And fear could be used. The countdown had begun. The hijacker's footsteps echoed through the cabin as he stormed toward the rear, his erratic pacing more unstable than before. His breathing came in heavy bursts, his muttering increasingly incoherent. Passengers kept their hands raised, terrified of making the slightest wrong move. The air had shifted. Fear was no longer a silent weight, but a suffocating blanket over every soul aboard. Claire sat frozen in her seat, arms still at her sides, her silence now a statement in itself. She had spoken once, and it had unsettled him. She would not waste words carelessly again. The SEAL commander beside her studied her profile with quiet intensity. He had seen many forms of courage in combat zones, reckless bravery, blind rage, even cold detachment. But what radiated from Claire was different. It was precision, the kind of calm, or not from ignorance of danger, but from staring it down, and refusing to blink. He leaned slightly closer, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You rattled him." Claire didn't look at him. Her eyes followed the hijacker's movements. "I exposed him." The commander tilted his head, intrigued. "And you're not afraid he'll come straight for you next?" Finally, Claire turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were steady, like still water concealing depth. He already did. He just hasn't finished it yet. The commander felt the truth in her words. The hijacker had zeroed in on her, the one passenger who didn't obey, the one who didn't flinch. In his mind, She was a threat to be crushed. Yet the more he tried, the more she exposed his weakness. The commander's instincts screamed at him. This woman wasn't ordinary. She was an asset. The hijacker suddenly whirled at the back of the plane, slamming the butt of his pistol against an overhead bin. The sharp crack echoed, startling the passengers into renewed whimpers. "Everyone stay quiet," he barked, though his own voice betrayed cracks. He was unraveling, losing the careful mask of authority. Claire noted every detail. His movements were jerky, his shouts increasingly shrill, his hand trembling around the weapon. Her father's voice came back to her unbidden from childhood days on the farm, teaching her how to read an animal before it bolted. Look at its eyes. Look at its breathing. Fear makes them unpredictable. Fear makes them dangerous. Her father had been talking about horses, but the principle applied here perfectly. The SEAL commander's arm shifted slightly. Claire felt it before she saw it, the weight of something pressed discreetly against her thigh beneath the cover of his jacket. Her heart lurched as she realized what it was. A gun. She glanced sharply at him. His expression didn't waver. Claire's fingers twitched against her knees. It had been years since she had held one, years since she swore she never would again. The weight of responsibility, the burden of potential death, it had always unsettled her. But in this moment, feeling the cold shape against her leg, she wasn't unsettled. She was awake. The commander's whisper broke through. "If I trust you, will you act?" The question hit harder than the weapon itself. Claire turned her head slightly, her voice barely audible. "Why me?" His jaw tightened. "Because you're the only one here who isn't afraid of him. Fear shows. Yours doesn't. He doesn't know how to read you, and that terrifies him." Her chest rose slowly as she inhaled. "What if you're wrong?" "Then we're dead already," he replied bluntly. For the first time since the hijacking began, Claire felt the world slow. The hum of the engines, the muffled sobs of passengers. Even the hijacker's shouts all blurred into a distant background. The only thing sharp in her awareness was the weight of the weapon, and the commander's eyes waiting for her answer. She closed her eyes briefly, and her father's voice came again. "When you hold a gun, you hold a choice. You don't pull the trigger unless you're ready to live with it afterward." When she opened her eyes, they were steady. "I won't act recklessly. But if he leaves me no choice, I won't hesitate." The commander gave a short nod. That was all he needed. At that moment, the hijacker spun back down the aisle, fury radiating from him. His eyes locked instantly onto Claire and the commander whispering. "You too," he shouted, pointing the gun. "What are you plotting?" Passengers gasped, eyes darting between them. Claire remained still, the commander calm. The hijacker stalked forward until the gun was inches from Claire's face. "You think you're brave, huh? Sitting there whispering? Defying me?" His voice cracked, louder than before, betraying desperation. Claire lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with unflinching calm. "You don't scare me." The cabin froze. The hijacker's face contorted in disbelief. His hand trembled violently around the weapon. For a moment, Claire thought he might pull the trigger just to prove her wrong. But the SEAL commander leaned back casually, injecting a sneer into his tone. "You heard her. You're not in control anymore. Everyone sees it. You've lost." The hijacker spun the gun between them, his fury splitting like a storm. "Shut up," he screamed. "I'm in charge here. I'm the one with the power." But even as he shouted it, Claire could see the truth in his eyes. He no longer believed it. The passengers sensed it too. There was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. For the first time since the ordeal began, the hijacker looked less like a figure of terror and more like a man unraveling under the weight of his own fear. Claire didn't smile, didn't smirk. She held his gaze, her silence more damning than words. The hijacker's breath grew ragged. He jabbed the gun at her once more, then abruptly turned and stormed toward the cockpit again, muttering curses. Under his breath, the tension broke in a wave of nervous exhales. The commander leaned closer, whispering again, "He'll come back for you. He won't let this go." Claire nodded once, her voice steady. "Then I'll be ready." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The passengers, though shaken, began stealing glances at her, at the woman who had spoken aloud what they couldn't. Some looked at her with gratitude, others with fear, but all with a dawning awareness. She had changed the game. Claire ignored their stares. She didn't do it for them. She did it because she knew the truth silence had been her shield, but now her words had become a weapon too. The SEAL commander finally allowed himself the faintest whisper, one that carried the weight of respect. "You may have just saved us all." Claire turned forward again, her expression unreadable. But deep inside, something stirred a quiet realization that she was no longer just a passenger. She was now part of the fight. And whether she liked it or not, the outcome rested, in part, on her shoulders. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hum of the engines filled the silence left in the hijacker's wake. He had stormed toward the front again, yelling curses under his breath, and for a brief moment, the cabin existed in uneasy stillness. Every passenger remained frozen in their seats, as though the slightest sound might trigger another outburst. The only movements were trembling hands wiping tears, and the quiet, stifled sobs of those who couldn't hold them back. Beside Claire, the SEAL commander adjusted in his seat, his posture deceptively relaxed. To the untrained eye, he looked calm, another weary traveler waiting for this nightmare to end. But Claire could feel the coiled readiness in him, the way every muscle held potential energy. He wasn't waiting. He was watching, preparing. She felt it before she saw it, the subtle pressure of something cold and heavy against her leg, concealed beneath his jacket. Her eyes flicked downward and caught the faint outline of metal in his hand. Pistol, compact, lethal, her breath caught in her chest. She hadn't held a gun in over 15 years. Not since the long summers on her father's farm, where discipline had been as common as dust and silence was the only refuge from his temper. Back then, firearms weren't tools of defense, but symbols of control, of rules she hadn't asked for. He had forced her to practice anyway. Day after day at the makeshift range behind the barn, the smell of gunpowder in the air, the sharp crack of bullets against rusted cans. At 15, she had hated it. At 37, sitting on a hijacked plane, she understood its purpose. The commander pressed the pistol closer, his voice barely above a breath. "Take it." Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hand hovered but didn't close around it. "Why me?" He didn't blink. "Because you're steady. Because you don't flinch. And because right now, you're the only one he fears." Her throat tightened. "I haven't done this in years." "You don't forget," he said firmly. "The body remembers. The hands remember. And when the time comes, you'll remember too." The weight of his trust pressed heavier than the steel itself. She looked into his eyes, searching for doubt, for hesitation. She found none. Only certainty. Only belief. Slowly, reluctantly, Claire wrapped her fingers around the grip. The cold metal settled into her palm with surprising familiarity, like a relic of another life she thought she'd buried. The balance, the texture, the silent promise, it all came back in an instant. The pistol was heavier than she remembered. Or maybe the weight wasn't physical at all. The commander released it fully into her hands, his gaze locked on hers. "This isn't about pulling the trigger. It's about choice. You have one now. Use it when it matters." Claire's pulse quickened, but her hands didn't shake. She rested the gun discreetly against her thigh, hidden from view, her body shielding it from the hijacker's line of sight. Passengers nearby noticed the exchange subtle glances, widened eyes, but none dared speak. They knew silence was survival. For a moment, the world shrank to the weight of steel in her palm. Memories flashed unbidden, her father's stern voice correcting her grip, her own angry tears at being forced to learn, the steady crack of target practice echoing across fields. She had hated every second. Yet those lessons had etched themselves into her muscles. She could still feel the rhythm. Breathe, aim, squeeze, steady. The hijacker's voice snapped her back to the present. "Don't think I don't see you whispering?" He bellowed from the front of the plane, spinning toward the cabin again. His eyes scanned furiously, landing on Claire and the commander. Rage twisted his face. "You think you can defy me?" He stormed down the aisle, gun raised, spittle flying as he shouted. "Stand up, both of you. Now!" Gasps rippled. Passengers recoiled, terrified the confrontation would end in blood. Claire's hand tightened around the pistol, hidden against her thigh. The commander gave her a single steady nod and slowly rose from his seat. His movements were calm, deliberate, designed to draw attention away from her. The hijacker shoved the gun toward him. "You think you're brave? Let's see how brave you are when I put a bullet in your skull." The commander smirked faintly, tilting his head. "If you were going to, you'd have done it already." The hijacker froze, startled by the boldness. His grip faltered just slightly, and that split-second hesitation was everything. Claire saw the crack widening in his resolve. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted the pistol onto her lap, keeping it hidden beneath her jacket. Her breathing steadied the way it had during long, endless hours on the farm range. Her father's voice returned, not harsh this time, but instructive, grounding. "Control your breath. The weapon obeys you, not the other way around." The hijacker barked, waving his gun wildly between the commander and the passengers. "You think I'm weak? You think I'm a joke?" Claire's voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. "You think shouting makes you strong. It doesn't. It makes you desperate." The hijacker's head snapped toward her, his fury reigniting. "Shut up!" But her gaze was unflinching, her silence returning after the words. She let the weight of it settle over him like a trap. The commander seized the opening. "She's right," he said coolly. "You're running out of time, and you know it. You've lost control. You can feel it slipping." The hijacker's gun trembled violently now. His hands betrayed the truth his mouth refused to admit. Claire's grip tightened on the pistol under her jacket. She hadn't drawn it yet. She didn't need to. The knowledge that she could was enough to steady her, enough to remind her she wasn't powerless. The hijacker screamed again, backing away, weapon jerking between targets, as though he couldn't decide where to point it. The passengers shrank lower in their seats, terrified he'd fire at random. Finally, he retreated toward the front again, shouting incoherently, "Don't test me. Don't you dare test me." His voice cracked, breaking under the weight of his own unraveling. When he disappeared near the cockpit, the cabin exhaled as one. The release of tension was almost audible, a wave of shaky breaths and muffled sobs. Claire lowered the pistol back against her thigh, hidden once more. Her chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm, steadying herself. The commander leaned close, whispering, "How does it feel?" She kept her eyes forward. "Heavy," he nodded. "Good. That means you understand what it's for." She said nothing more. Her silence was both shield and weapon now, as it had always been. But deep inside, she knew something irreversible had shifted. The moment she closed her hand around the gun, she had stepped into a role she couldn't escape. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was part of the fight. And soon, she would be the hinge on which survival turned. The cabin was electric with tension. Every passenger remained frozen, arms trembling, eyes wide, as if a single wrong movement could ignite catastrophe. The hijacker had returned from the cockpit, his presence heavier now, his anger sharper, more unstable. His fingers shook around the pistol, his breaths coming in ragged bursts that betrayed exhaustion and fear he refused to acknowledge. Claire Morgan sat with the pistol still hidden beneath her jacket, her posture rigid but calm. Her mind moved in precise calculations, angles, distances, timing. She studied the hijacker as she once studied horses back on her father's farm. Every twitch, every heartbeat, every tell revealing vulnerabilities. The SEAL commander beside her adjusted slightly, signaling with a subtle tilt of his head. Claire understood immediately. It was time. The hijacker had begun pacing again, jerking the gun toward passengers, shouting fragmented threats. His hands trembled more with each word. His fury was no longer an assertion of power. It was a mask for panic. Claire pressed the pistol closer. To her side, hidden but ready. She breathed slowly, grounding herself. The lessons of her youth, the countless hours spent at the makeshift range, returned instinctively. Sight, trigger, breathing. Precision born of repetition. The hijacker barked at the passengers, pointing the gun at a young man near the window. "Sit down. Don't move. I will shoot." Claire noticed the misstep immediately. The man's wrist brushed a nearby tray table, inadvertently causing a faint clatter. The hijacker flinched violently, shaking the gun in panic. This was it, the crack in his armor. The commander whispered, just loud enough for Claire. "Your moment. Calm, precise. Make it count." Her hand closed firmly around the grip beneath. Her jacket. She didn't aim yet. Not until the alignment, the timing, was perfect. She had no intention of acting recklessly. Every second counted. Every sound, every twitch of the hijacker's fingers mattered. He swung the gun in the aisle, threatening a row of terrified passengers. Claire's gaze flicked along the plane, noting the distances between him and the nearest obstacles, the gaps the commander had created through subtle distraction. The SEALs were poised, coiled like springs. The hijacker's attention shifted abruptly to her again. "You," he shouted, pointing. "Sit down. Stop staring at me." Claire's eyes held his without fear. Her silence was a weapon. Every second he stared at her, uncertainty flickered across his face. His control weakened further. Then finally he moved again, stalking closer, shouting threats. Claire's hand rose slowly, bringing the pistol to rest just beneath her jacket. Flap, aimed subtly but unseen. Her breath was even. She was ready. The hijacker's finger twitched on the trigger as he reached the midpoint of the cabin. His steps faltered. Fear and rage wrestled visibly across his face. "Do it!" he screamed suddenly, spinning toward her. "Do you want me to kill everyone?" Claire didn't answer. She only pressed her body slightly back into the seat. Maintaining cover and concealment, her mind raced. Pulling the trigger now could be catastrophic if mistimed. She needed perfect alignment. The commander leaned in, whispering, "Wait for his chest. That's your opening." The hijackers. Attention snapped toward a flight attendant, attempting to help another passenger. His arm jerked, the gun shaking. That's when Claire acted. With controlled precision, she shifted her pistol slightly, aligning it along the trajectory the commander had indicated. Her finger hovered lightly near the trigger, not yet squeezing. The hijacker's attention remained on the cabin chaos. A critical error. A single step, just one, and he would be in position. The commander caught his motion, adjusting silently. Claire inhaled, timing her breath with his heartbeat, the moment compressing into a knife edge of possibility. He lunged slightly forward, raising the gun toward an elderly woman. Claire's hand moved in perfect sync with her training. She pressed the trigger. No sudden movement, no panic, just controlled force. The shot rang out. The cabin erupted into a cacophony of gasps and screams, but the hijacker crumpled instantly, the pistol falling from his trembling hands. Silence followed, heavy and stunned. Claire's heart raced, yet her hands remained steady. The weight of the pistol felt heavier now, not just steel, but the responsibility she had carried in that single, precise action. The SEAL commander moved swiftly, handcuffing the hijacker with trained efficiency, while the other SEALs secured the cabin. Passengers stared, their fear and awe mingling. Many of them had no idea what had happened so fast, only that the immediate threat had ended. Claire lowered the pistol slowly, exhaling in a controlled rhythm. The commander glanced at her briefly, eyes filled with quiet respect. "You did it," he said. She nodded slightly, the adrenaline still coursing, her body tense but composed. "It wasn't just me," she murmured. The commander allowed a faint smile. "It doesn't matter. You were ready when it counted." Passengers began to move cautiously, some crying, some embracing, still shaken but alive. Claire observed each face, her silence returning as the adrenaline ebbed. She hadn't acted for recognition, only necessity. For the first time, the enormity of what she had done settled over her. She had stepped into a role she never sought. She had held a weapon, confronted danger, and survived, not because she sought heroism, but because she refused to flinch when every instinct screamed to hide. The hijacker was restrained and under control. The SEALs moved methodically to ensure no threats remained. Claire kept her eyes forward, hands folded once more, but inside, she felt the quiet stirrings of something she hadn't experienced before. The acknowledgement that she could make a difference even in the worst circumstances. The commander leaned closer, whispering softly, "You were calm when it mattered most. That's rare." Claire nodded, her gaze returning to the front. The hijacker was silent now, the weapon safely removed, the threat neutralized. The passengers. Fear began to transform into relief, their gratitude palpable, even if unspoken. The cabin still buzzed with tension, but it was tempered by survival. For Claire, silence was no longer simply protection. It had become power, the ability to observe, calculate, and act decisively when the world demanded it. As the plane continued its flight, she reflected quietly. Fear had not dictated her actions. Rage had not fueled her hand. Only focus, only precision, and only the careful use of silence had guided her. The SEAL commander finally nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of respect, trust, and understanding. Claire didn't smile. She returned the gesture with her calm, silent composure. She didn't need words. The plane, once a theater of terror, now carried survivors, aware that the line between life and death had been walked by a woman who had stayed silent until the right moment to act. And she had acted. The cabin was heavy with relief, yet it remained charged with the residue of fear. The hijacker lay restrained, silent, his frantic energy replaced by stunned realization. Passengers were still frozen in their seats, some crying, some embracing. Loved ones, and others simply staring, trying to comprehend that the nightmare had ended. Claire Morgan lowered the pistol completely, resting it in her lap, the weight now both physical and symbolic. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain in a controlled rhythm, though adrenaline still thrummed through her veins. Every heartbeat reminded her that she had not only survived, but had taken control in a situation that had once seemed hopeless. The SEAL commander stood nearby, surveying the cabin. His calm presence had steadied her throughout the ordeal, but now it was punctuated with approval. He nodded toward her, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Claire didn't smile or speak. Her silence alone conveyed comprehension, gratitude, and the quiet pride of having acted decisively when it counted. Around her, passengers began to move cautiously. A mother gathered her child, whispering soothing words through tears. Business travelers clutched each other, shaking, as if the act of being alive again was miraculous. Claire's eyes swept the cabin, noting the subtle gestures of relief, the way some held onto their belongings, as if they had been returned from the brink of oblivion, the way others pressed hands to mouths, almost afraid that sound might shatter. The fragile peace. The hijacker remained on the floor, restrained by the seals, his face pale and tight. He no longer screamed or shouted. His bravado had dissolved entirely. Claire observed him silently, cataloging every detail, the same way she had from the very beginning. She understood now that terror and control were illusions. He had grasped her authority with a weapon, but it was empty. True power had never been in the gun. It had been in resolve. The SEAL commander approached her once more, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. His expression was unreadable but intense, as though weighing her every thought. "You did exactly what needed to be done," he said softly. Claire's voice remained quiet, calm. "We did it." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Perhaps, but you were the hinge on which survival turned." The words settled over her like a stone. She didn't respond. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "When the time comes, act without hesitation." She had, and now the weight of that action pressed against her, not guilt, not fear, but clarity. Passengers were being directed by flight attendants, their hands guided to safety procedures as the plane stabilized. The tension gradually shifted into murmurs of disbelief and gratitude. People whispered thanks to the SEALs to each other, and in some cases, to Claire herself, though she remained still, silent, observing the scene with measured attention. A young boy approached her timidly, holding out a small, crumpled toy he had clutched during the ordeal. You saved us," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked at him, her eyes calm but soft. She gave the faintest nod, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement without grandeur. "Stay close to your mother," she said gently. The boy's mother stepped forward, wrapping him in her arms, tears streaming freely. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "Thank you." Claire returned to her seat, hands folded, watching the scene unfold. Relief was palpable now, but so was the lingering understanding of the fragility of life. Every breath, every heartbeat, every second she had remained calm, had been a decision, a conscious act of observation, calculation, and courage. The hijacker, still restrained, was being prepared for the authorities upon landing. His eyes flicked toward Claire. Once briefly, a mixture of disbelief and anger, but the fight had left him. For the first time, he understood he had lost, not because he had failed to control others, but because he had never controlled himself. The SEAL commander stood nearby, surveying the passengers once more. He approached Claire and extended his hand briefly, not in formality, but in recognition. "You kept your head when others couldn't," he said quietly. "That's rare." Claire accepted the gesture, gripping his hand firmly. "It wasn't about me," she replied. "It was about staying alive and keeping everyone else alive." "Too." He allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's hard to do both at once. Most people fail at one or the other." She exhaled softly, glancing around the cabin. The passengers were beginning to recover, murmuring to each other, touching their loved ones, and some even daring small smiles. Claire understood the significance of what had happened. Fear had dominated these hours, but courage had emerged from unexpected places. Quiet, deliberate, and resolute courage. The flight attendants began to restore order, calming passengers, and guiding them through procedures. Claire observed them, noting their composure despite visible fear. She admired their professionalism, the way they continued to function amidst chaos, and silently recognized the courage it took to stay upright when the world had tilted violently. The plane's engines hummed steadily now, the threat finally neutralized, the tension slowly ebbing from the cabin. Passengers were allowed to move freely, and murmurs of relief filled the air. Claire remained seated for a long moment, pistol resting on her lap, the weight now symbolic, a reminder of the responsibility she had borne and the choices she had made. Finally, she allowed herself a brief glance toward the SEAL commander. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, she felt acknowledgement, respect, and shared understanding. She hadn't sought recognition. She had acted because it was necessary. And now, in the aftermath, that action carried meaning far beyond herself. She thought of her father again, the long afternoons on the farm, the drills and lessons that had once felt cruel, but had prepared her for this. The fear she had felt in those moments, the resistance, the reluctance, all had forged the skills and resilience she had drawn upon today. Claire's silence had been her shield, her observation her strategy, and her decisive action the turning point. She had not only survived, but had influenced the outcome for dozens of lives. That understanding settled over her, quiet but profound. The passengers gradually began to speak among themselves, sharing words of reassurance and relief. Claire watched silently, noting the subtle changes in demeanor, the release of tension, the return of color to faces drained of life moments before. Life, fragile and precious, had resumed. The SEAL commander approached one final time, standing near her seat. "You've handled yourself extraordinarily," he said. "If it were up to me, I'd have you on every operation I plan." Claire allowed a faint, unassuming nod. She didn't smile. Recognition wasn't her goal. Survival, for herself and others, had been her mission. But acknowledgement, even in small measure, was quietly satisfying. As the plane continued toward its destination, the hijacker secured and powerless, Claire reflected on the hours that had passed. Fear, chaos, and the threat of death had been constant companions. Yet she had discovered something deeper about herself, the ability to remain composed, to act decisively, and to wield courage in silence until it was required. The passengers, slowly reclaiming their sense of normalcy, were unaware of the precise moments that had determined life or death. Claire had been a quiet hinge, unremarked but essential. That, she thought, was often how courage truly manifested, not in the accolades, not in the recognition, but in the deliberate choices made when no one else could act. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to exhale fully, her mind finally resting after hours of acute vigilance. The weight of the pistol on her lap felt lighter now, transformed from an instrument of potential violence into a symbol of the resolve she had embodied. The cabin, once filled with chaos, now carried a subdued reverence. Claire observed it all with her usual measured attention, her silence a continuation of the vigilance that had carried them through. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the quiet relief of a life preserved, not just her own, but those of strangers who now owed their survival, in part, to her courage. And as the plane descended, passengers finally murmuring tentative gratitude and awe, Claire understood the full magnitude of what had transpired. The hijacker's threat had been neutralized. Lives had been preserved. And within herself, a new understanding had emerged. Courage, discipline, and calm focus could, indeed, turn the tide even in the face of chaos. She looked to the SEAL commander once more. Their eyes met. No words were needed. The acknowledgement passed silently between them. One had survived not by chance, but through observation, resolve, and decisive action when the moment demanded it. Claire Morgan's role in the ordeal had concluded. The plane was safe. Passengers were alive, the hijacker powerless. And in that quiet, unspoken acknowledgement, she understood something vital. Silence had been her shield, courage her weapon, and calm her victory.